In the vast, interconnected world of the early 21st century, there existed a place that was nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't a physical location you could find on a map, but a sprawling, anonymous marketplace hidden in the deepest, darkest corners of the digital universe. Its founder was not a grizzled cartel boss or a traditional kingpin, but a brilliant young physicist, a quiet idealist who believed he had found a way to use technology to create a world of perfect, unregulated liberty. He was a ghost in the machine, known to his thousands of customers only by his theatrical nom de plume, the Dread Pirate Roberts. Tonight, we journey into the hidden worlds that exist just beneath the surface of our own, marketplaces of secrets and digital empires built on the silent language of code. These are stories about the collision of radical new ideologies with old-world institutions, of crimes that have no physical crime scene, and of the epic, high-stakes manhunts to find the brilliant, anonymous figures who control them from the cool glow of a computer screen in a darkened room. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always a humbling experience to see how far these stories travel, and how many of us are gathered here in this shared, quiet space. And on that note, if you truly appreciate what we do here, the quiet, respectful space we try to create for these stories, a like and a subscribe is the very best way to show it. It helps us continue this journey together. Now, dim the lights. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Silk Road, the internet, as most of us know, it is just the surface of a much deeper, more mysterious ocean. Beneath the familiar world of search engines, social media, and online shopping lies the deep web, a vast repository of unindexed content. And within that deep web, there is another, even more hidden layer, a place accessible only through specialized software that anonymizes its users' identities. This is the dark web, a haven for secrets, dissent, and, inevitably, a thriving black market. It was in this digital abyss that one of the most audacious criminal enterprises of the modern era was born. The creator of this enterprise was not a career criminal. He was, by all accounts, a model American son. Ross Ulbricht was a bright, curious, and deeply idealistic young man from Austin, Texas. An Eagle Scout with a master's degree in materials science and engineering, he was a staunch libertarian, a devout believer in the economic theories of Ludwig von Mises and the Austrian school. He believed that individual liberty was paramount and that government intervention, particularly in the form of regulation and prohibition, was not just inefficient but immoral. He was especially passionate about ending the war on drugs, which he saw as a destructive, violent, and failed policy that created more harm than it prevented. In 2010, Ulbricht was living a quiet life, running a small used book business and searching for a way to make his mark on the world. He was fascinated by the emerging technologies of the dark web, particularly the anonymizing network known as Tor, and a new, decentralized digital currency called Bitcoin. In these two technologies, he saw the building blocks of a revolution. Tor could provide anonymity, and Bitcoin could provide a secure, untraceable means of exchange. He realized he could combine them to create something that had never existed before. A completely anonymous, frictionless, and global free market, one where anyone could buy and sell anything, completely outside the reach of any government or law enforcement agency. It was a radical, almost utopian vision. He believed that by creating such a marketplace, he could prove the validity of his libertarian principles. He theorized that by taking the drug trade out of the hands of violent street gangs and cartels and placing it in an open, online marketplace with user reviews and reputational feedback, the violence associated with it would simply disappear. In his mind, he was not building a criminal enterprise. He was conducting a grand economic and social experiment. In early 2011, working alone on his laptop, Ross Ulbricht began to build his creation. He taught himself to code and painstakingly constructed the website. He gave it an evocative name, one that conjured images of ancient trade routes and exotic, forbidden goods, the Silk Road, and for himself, he adopted a persona, a nom de plume that provided a layer of mythic anonymity. He borrowed the name from his favorite film, The Princess Bride. He would be the site's enigmatic, all-powerful leader, the Dread Pirate Roberts. The Silk Road went live in February 2011. Its design was revolutionary in its simplicity. It looked and functioned much like a legitimate e-commerce site, such as eBay or Amazon. Users could browse listings for a vast array of illicit goods, primarily drugs of every conceivable variety: heroin, cocaine, LSD, ecstasy, but also forged documents, hacking software, and other contraband. Vendors could set up their own digital storefronts, and buyers could leave public reviews and ratings, creating a self-regulating system of trust and reputation. All transactions were conducted in Bitcoin and processed through an escrow system controlled by the Dread Pirate Roberts, who took a commission on every sale. At first, the site was a tiny, obscure corner of the dark web, its existence known only to a handful of users on niche forums. Ulbricht himself was the site's first vendor, having grown his own psilocybin mushrooms to seed the marketplace. But word began to spread with viral speed through the interconnected worlds of drug culture, cryptography, and libertarian activism. The site's user base exploded. It was a stunning success, a perfect marriage of a radical ideology and a powerful new technology. The moment that propelled the Silk Road from a dark web secret into a full-blown national security threat came in June of 2011. A writer for the website Gawker published a sensational article titled, "The Underground Website Where You Can Buy Any Drug Imaginable." The article was a detailed, almost breathless tour of the site, describing its vast inventory and its user-friendly interface. It went viral. Overnight, the Silk Road became a media phenomenon. The publicity was a double-edged sword. It brought a massive influx of new users, and the site's revenue soared into the millions. But it also brought the full, crushing attention of federal law enforcement. Senator Chuck Schumer of New York held a press conference, holding up a printout of the Gawker article and demanding that the federal government shut down this brazen and shocking online drug bazaar. "This is the most blatant attempt to peddle drugs online that we have ever seen," he declared. Suddenly, the Silk Road was on the radar of every major federal agency: the DEA, the FBI, the IRS, and the Department of Homeland Security. A multi-agency federal task force was assembled, based in New York City, with a single, daunting objective: to identify and capture the Dread Pirate Roberts and dismantle his digital empire. But the task was unlike any they had ever faced. They were hunting a ghost. The entire Silk Road ecosystem was designed to be anonymous. The servers were hidden behind the layers of the Tor network, making their physical location nearly impossible to trace. The transactions were conducted in Bitcoin, a currency that was, at the time, largely opaque to law enforcement. And all the users, from the buyers and sellers to the site administrators, were hidden behind pseudonyms. There was no physical crime scene to investigate, no witnesses to interview, no paper trail to follow. The only evidence was a stream of encrypted data, and the only suspect was a character from a fairy tale. The manhunt for the Dread Pirate Roberts, the first great cybercrime investigation of the 21st century, had begun. The hunt for the Dread Pirate Roberts was, from the outset, an exercise in profound frustration. The multi-agency task force, composed of some of the best investigators from the FBI, DEA, and Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, found themselves confronting an enemy they couldn't see, in a territory they barely understood. They were men and women accustomed to kicking down doors, flipping informants, and following paper trails. Now they were staring at impenetrable walls of code. Every lead seemed to vanish into the digital ether. Their initial efforts were a series of dead ends. They conducted undercover buys on the Silk Road, purchasing small amounts of drugs which would arrive, as promised, in vacuum-sealed packages in the mail. But tracing these packages back to the vendors was nearly impossible. The sellers used sophisticated methods to obscure their identities, shipping from post offices far from their homes and using fake return addresses. The investigators were building dozens of small cases against low-level drug dealers, but they were no closer to the kingpin. Following the money was equally futile. Bitcoin, the lifeblood of the Silk Road, was a ghost currency to them. They could see the transactions on the public blockchain, but the addresses were just strings of anonymous numbers and letters. The money moved through a series of tumblers, services that would mix and churn the currency, breaking the chain of ownership and making it virtually untraceable. The task force was chasing shadows in a digital wilderness. The leader of this phantom empire, the Dread Pirate Roberts, seemed omniscient and untouchable. He communicated with his staff and his users through encrypted messages. His persona, a carefully crafted blend of libertarian ideologue, benevolent dictator, and ruthless businessman. On the Silk Road forums, he would hold court, expounding on his economic and political philosophies, explaining why the site was a moral and ethical necessity. He was, to his followers, a visionary, a digital Che Guevara fighting for their freedom. But behind the mask of the dread pirate Roberts, the reality of Ross Ulbricht was beginning to fray. The quiet, idealistic experiment had metastasized into a sprawling, multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise with thousands of vendors and hundreds of thousands of users. He was now the CEO of a massive, illegal corporation. He had to manage a paid staff of administrators and forum moderators. He had to deal with server crashes, hacker attacks, and customer service disputes. The weight of his creation, and the constant fear of being caught, was immense. The libertarian idealist was becoming a paranoid and increasingly isolated kingpin. This transformation from idealist to pragmatist took a dark and decisive turn in March of 2013. A Silk Road vendor, a man from British Columbia known by the username Friendly Chemist, was arrested by local authorities. Fearing a long prison sentence, Friendly Chemist decided to turn on his master. He managed to hack another, larger vendor on the site and steal a list of the real names and addresses of thousands of Silk Road customers. He then sent a message to the dread pirate Roberts with a simple, terrifying demand. Pay him $500,000, or he would release the entire list to the public, effectively destroying the site and exposing its users to law enforcement. For Ross Ulbricht, this was an existential threat. The anonymity of his users was the sacred principle upon which the entire Silk Road was built. He couldn't go to the police. He was the police. He had to handle the problem himself. The non-aggression principle, the core tenet of the libertarian philosophy he espoused, was about to be put to the ultimate test. It failed. Ulbricht, as the dread pirate Roberts, contacted another user on the site, a man who went by the name Redandwhite, who claimed to be a high-level member of a major drug trafficking organization. DPR asked him a chilling question. Could he arrange to have Friendly Chemist executed? Redandwhite readily agreed, quoting a price of between $150,000 and $300,000, depending on whether DPR wanted the kill to be clean or not clean. In the cold, dispassionate language of a business transaction, the two men negotiated the price of a human life. I wouldn't mind if he was executed, DPR wrote in an encrypted chat. He eventually agreed on a price of 1,670 Bitcoin, worth approximately $150,000 at the time. He provided Redandwhite with Friendly Chemist's real name and address. A few days later, Redandwhite sent a message back. Your problem has been taken care of. He sent a photograph as proof, a picture of a man seemingly dead, with a can of soup placed on his chest as a signifier. DPR was satisfied. I'm pissed I had to kill him, he wrote in his journal. But what's done is done. Ross Ulbricht, the Eagle Scout from Austin, now believed he was a murderer. The irony, which he would not learn until much later, was that the entire hit was a scam. The user, Redandwhite, was not a contract killer. He was a con artist. The man, Friendly Chemist, had been arrested on unrelated charges. The photo was a fake. But in Ulbricht's mind, the Rubicon had been crossed. He had proven to himself that he was willing to use lethal violence to protect his empire. And having crossed that line once, it became easier to cross it again. Just a few weeks later, a new crisis emerged. A Silk Road employee named Curtis Green, who went by the username Chronic Pain, was arrested by federal agents. Green was a 47-year-old grandfather from Utah who had been one of DPR's paid site administrators. The DEA had caught him in a drug deal, and now he was in custody. Ulbricht was terrified. Green knew too much about the inner workings of the site. If he talked, it could lead the investigation directly to him. Once again, the dread pirate Roberts decided on a final, violent solution. He contacted a different user, a man he had been using to source drugs, a user named Knob. DPR believed Knob was a major player in a Hells Angels-affiliated drug ring. He told Knob that his employee, Curtis Green, had been arrested and had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars in Bitcoin from Silk Road users. He asked Knob to arrange to have Green taken care of. The price was set at $80,000. The order was placed. I'd have no problem with him being executed, DPR wrote to Knob. A few days later, Knob sent DPR a message confirming that the hit had been carried out. He sent staged photographs as proof, pictures of Curtis Green seemingly being tortured, and then, finally, a photo of his lifeless face. Got the info, Knob wrote. He's gone. I'm glad I don't have to worry about him anymore, DPR replied. He now believed he was responsible for the deaths of at least 2 people, all to protect his anonymous free market. But this second hit was also a deception, a far more dangerous one for Ulbricht. The user Knob was not a member of the Hells Angels. He was a federal agent. Specifically, he was DEA agent Carl Force, who was working undercover on the Silk Road Task Force. The entire murder-for-hire plot had been a sting operation. The DEA had staged the kidnapping and faked the photos with the full cooperation of Curtis Green. They now had their prime suspect, the enigmatic Dread Pirate Roberts, on tape, ordering the murder of one of his own employees. The net was closing, but the investigators still didn't know who he was. They had a digital persona, a confession to a murder plot, but no real name, no physical location. They were getting closer to the ghost, but he was still a phantom. Meanwhile, Ross Ulbricht sat in a quiet coffee shop in San Francisco, running his billion-dollar empire from his laptop, unaware that the walls he had so carefully constructed around his digital fortress were about to come crashing down. While the DEA was running its elaborate and ethically questionable murder-for-hire sting against the Dread Pirate Roberts, a different kind of investigator using a completely different set of tools was making the breakthrough that would ultimately unmask the Phantom. This investigator was not a seasoned homicide detective or an undercover drug agent. He was a quiet, unassuming, and brilliant young tax agent from the Internal Revenue Service named Gary Alford. Alford was part of the multi-agency task force, but he approached the problem not as a drug case, but as a massive, untaxed financial enterprise. He was not interested in the drugs or the assassins. He was interested in the money trail. But more importantly, he was interested in the one thing that all criminals, even digital ones, possess: a past. He theorized that the Dread Pirate Roberts, despite his masterful command of online anonymity, must have made a mistake somewhere, most likely in the very beginning, before the Silk Road was a billion-dollar empire, back when he was just a lone idealist building a website. He believed that if you could find the first mention of the Silk Road anywhere on the internet, you might just find the real identity of its creator. This was a search for a digital needle in a planet-sized haystack. For weeks, Alford sat at his desk, meticulously scouring the internet, using every search engine and every combination of search terms he could imagine. He went back in time, changing the date parameters of his searches, digging through the earliest, most obscure corners of the web. And then he found it. The breakthrough came from a single, innocuous post on a web forum for magic mushroom enthusiasts. The post was from January 27, 2011, just days before the Silk Road officially launched. A user with the handle Altoid had made a post asking a question about growing mushrooms. A few months later, in October of that same year, the user Altoid made another post, this time on a Bitcoin forum. In this post, he was promoting a new anonymous marketplace. "I'm thinking of creating a website where people can buy and sell anything anonymously," he wrote. "It's called the Silk Road." And at the end of the post, trying to solicit programming help, he made a single catastrophic mistake. He included an email address, rosselbricht@gmail.com. It was the slip-up Gary Alford had been searching for. It was the first and only time that the real name of Ross Ulbricht had ever been publicly connected to the Silk Road. The ghost now had a name. The investigative floodgates opened. The task force now had a target, a real person with a history, a family, and a physical location. They descended on Ross Ulbricht's life. They discovered he was a former Eagle Scout with a master's degree in engineering. They found his libertarian writings, his posts on the Mises Institute forums, which mirrored the exact philosophical language used by the Dread Pirate Roberts. They uncovered his LinkedIn profile, which contained a chillingly prescient statement of purpose. "I am creating an economic simulation to give people a first-hand experience of what it would be like to live in a world without the systemic use of force, as a means of creating a world without coercion and aggression." He had, in his own words, described the Silk Road experiment. The evidence was circumstantial but incredibly powerful. But they still needed to definitively link Ross Ulbricht, the man, to the active, real-time persona of the Dread Pirate Roberts. They needed to catch him in the act, logged into the site as its master administrator. To do that, they first had to find the physical location of the Silk Road servers. This part of the investigation was being led by the FBI. Using sophisticated network analysis and a bit of luck, they managed to trace a faint digital signal leaking from one of the site's servers. The IP address was not hidden behind the layers of Tor. It was a single, vulnerable point. They traced the address, and it led them not to a shadowy data haven in Eastern Europe, but to a server farm in Iceland. The FBI, working with Icelandic authorities, secretly made a complete copy of the Silk Road servers. They now had everything: the user data, the transaction logs, the vendor information, and, most importantly, the private, encrypted messages of the Dread Pirate Roberts himself. With the server data in hand, they could now trace the IP address from which the master administrator was logging in. The signal led them to a laptop that was connecting to the internet from a small cafe on Laguna Street in San Francisco. Ross Ulbricht had moved to San Francisco a few months earlier, trying to blend into the city's tech scene. The final stage of the manhunt was set. They had found his digital cave. The plan for the arrest was as delicate and as carefully orchestrated as a spy movie. They couldn't just rush in and grab him. If he saw them coming, he could close his laptop, and with a few keystrokes, activate a full-disk encryption key that would render the entire machine a useless, unreadable brick. All the evidence they needed to definitively tie him to the DPR persona. The private keys to the Bitcoin wallets, the unencrypted chat logs, the server login credentials would be lost forever. They needed to get the laptop away from him while it was still open and active. On the afternoon of October 1st, 2013, Ross Ulbricht was sitting in the science fiction section of the Glen Park branch of the San Francisco Public Library, logged into his laptop. He was, at that very moment, logged into the Silk Road's administrative panel, communicating with an undercover agent he knew as Cirrus, whom he believed was a new employee he was training. Outside the library, a team of FBI agents was in position. They had a plan. 2 agents, a man and a woman, would stage a loud, distracting argument near where Ulbricht was sitting. As he looked up, momentarily distracted by the commotion, another agent would swiftly move in, grab the open laptop, and pass it to a 4th agent, a forensic specialist who would immediately begin securing the data. The plan went off perfectly. The agents entered the library. The lovers' quarrel began, loud and dramatic. Ulbricht, just as they had predicted, looked up from his screen, annoyed by the noise. In that split second of distraction, Agent Tom Kiernan lunged, snatched the open laptop, and handed it off. Other agents swarmed Ulbricht, tackling him to the ground and handcuffing him before he even knew what was happening. On the screen of the open laptop, the FBI agents saw exactly what they were hoping for. He was logged into the Silk Road. The master administrator page was open. He was in mid-conversation with their own undercover agent. The Dread Pirate Roberts, the enigmatic, untouchable kingpin of the dark web, had been caught. The ghost in the machine was just a 29-year-old man in a t-shirt and jeans, sitting in a public library. The greatest cyber manhunt in history was over. The arrest of Ross Ulbricht and the seizure of his laptop was a catastrophic, fatal blow to the Silk Road empire. With the master administrator in custody and the servers compromised, the site was shut down by the FBI within days. A seizure notice appeared on the homepage, its stark, official language replacing the familiar black market listings, a digital tombstone for the libertarian utopia. The news sent shockwaves through the dark web and the global cryptocurrency community. The invincible, anonymous marketplace had been conquered, and its mythical leader was now in chains. The trial of Ross Ulbricht began in federal court in Manhattan in January 2015. The prosecution, led by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, laid out a methodical and damning case. They presented the vast trove of evidence recovered from Ulbricht's laptop and the Silk Road servers. This was the digital equivalent of a smoking gun. They had his personal journal, in which he had chronicled the creation and growth of the site in meticulous detail, writing, I began my journey with the Silk Road, and the rest is history. They had chat logs where, as the dread pirate Roberts, he managed his staff, negotiated with vendors, and, most chillingly, ordered the murders for hire. The defense, led by attorney Joshua Drattle, faced an almost impossible task. They did not deny that Ulbricht had created the Silk Road. Instead, they attempted a bold and highly unorthodox strategy. They argued that Ulbricht, the young idealist, had indeed created the site as an economic experiment, but that he had quickly realized it was too much for him to handle. He had, they claimed, sold the site to another, more sophisticated party, and had been lured back into the fold near the end only to be set up as the fall guy. They argued that the real dread pirate Roberts was still out there. They pointed the finger at other potential suspects, including the flamboyant founder of the first Bitcoin exchange, Mark Karpelès. The centerpiece of their argument was to try and discredit the investigation itself. They highlighted the shocking corruption of the two federal agents who had been central to the case. DA agent Carl Force, the undercover operative Knob, who had staged the fake murder of Curtis Green, was later convicted of extortion, money laundering, and obstruction of justice for stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars in Bitcoin from the government and from Ulbricht himself during the investigation. Sean Bridges, a Secret Service agent on the task force, was also convicted of stealing over $800,000 in Bitcoin from Silk Road accounts. The defense argued that this deep-seated corruption proved the investigation was tainted and that evidence could have been planted or manipulated. But the jury was not swayed. The personal journal, the chat logs, and the sheer weight of the digital evidence on Ulbricht's own laptop were too much to overcome. The fall guy defense seemed implausible. After a 3-week trial, the jury deliberated for just over 3 hours. They found Ross Ulbricht guilty on all 7 counts, including drug trafficking, conspiracy, and money laundering. The question then turned to his sentence. The prosecution argued for the harshest possible punishment, portraying Ulbricht not as a misguided idealist, but as a ruthless digital drug kingpin who was responsible for facilitating over $1 billion in illegal transactions and who had been willing to resort to murder to protect his empire. The defense pleaded for leniency, emphasizing his nonviolent history and his philosophical motivations. In May 2015, Judge Catherine Forrest delivered her sentence. She condemned Ulbricht's actions in the strongest possible terms, calling his creation of the Silk Road terribly destructive to our social fabric. She sentenced him to 2 life sentences plus 40 years, with no possibility of parole. It was a sentence far harsher than many expected, a clear signal from the government that the perceived anonymity of the dark web would not protect criminals from the full force of the law. The legacy of the Silk Road is a powerful and complex one. It was a landmark case that fundamentally altered the landscape of law enforcement in the digital age. It forced federal agencies to rapidly develop new techniques for tracking cryptocurrency, navigating the dark web, and combating anonymous criminal enterprises. The hunt for the dread pirate Roberts became the blueprint for 21st century cybercrime investigation. The case also served as a cautionary tale about the dark side of utopian idealism. Ross Ulbricht's journey from a principled libertarian to a man willing to order murders to protect his creation is a chilling illustration of how noble ideas can be corrupted by power and pragmatism. His anonymous free market did not eliminate violence. It simply created a new context for it, and in the end, it turned him into the very kind of coercive actor he had claimed to despise. For the libertarian and cryptocurrency communities, Ulbricht remains a deeply polarizing figure. To some, he is a political prisoner, a visionary who was unfairly targeted and harshly punished by a government that felt threatened by his ideas of radical freedom. They see him as a martyr in the ongoing war between decentralization and state control. To others, he is a cautionary tale, a brilliant mind who was seduced by his own ideology, ignoring the real-world harm, the addictions, the overdoses, the violence that his economic experiment facilitated. In the years since its demise, the spirit of the Silk Road has proven impossible to extinguish. Dozens of copycat dark web marketplaces have sprung up, each attempting to fill the void it left behind, each one locked in the same cat-and-mouse game with law enforcement. The technology of anonymity and decentralization has only grown more sophisticated. Ross Ulbricht remains in a maximum security federal prison, now a man in his 40s, destined to spend the rest of his life behind bars. His appeals have all been denied. From his cell, he communicates through his family via Twitter, continuing to advocate for the ideals that led him to create his digital empire. The Dread Pirate Roberts is gone, but the questions he raised about privacy, freedom, and the future of crime in a digital world continue to echo, a permanent and unsettling legacy of the Boy Scout who became the dark web's first kingpin. The Vampire of Dusseldorf. The city of Dusseldorf in 1929 was a city of ghosts. It was a place haunted by the recent memory of the Great War, by the specter of hyperinflation that had just recently been tamed, and by the brittle, decadent glamour of the Weimar Republic. It was a city of stark contrasts. A powerhouse of German industry, its smokestacks belching black clouds into the Rhineland sky, but also a city of profound social and political turmoil. There was a frenetic, almost desperate energy in its cabarets and jazz clubs, a sense of a society dancing on the edge of a volcano, with the dark shadows of Nazism and communism gathering on the horizon. It was a city of progress and paranoia, a place where the old world was dying and the new one had not yet been fully born. It was into this anxious, volatile landscape that a new kind of ghost would emerge, a phantom who would terrorize the city and give a face to its deepest, most unspoken fears. The terror began not as a flood, but as a series of small, isolated trickles, strange and disturbing acts of violence that, at first, seemed to have no connection to one another. In February of 1929, a woman was stabbed multiple times, and a young girl, an 8-year-old named Rosa Olliger, was found murdered, her body violated and set on fire in an abandoned factory. The crimes were brutal but were seen as separate, tragic events in a city already hardened to violence. Then, the attacks began to accelerate, and a pattern, or rather a terrifying lack of one, began to emerge. The phantom seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, his methods constantly shifting. He was an arsonist, setting fire to haystacks and farmsteads on the outskirts of the city, seemingly for the sheer, aesthetic pleasure of watching the flames against the night sky. He was a predator who stalked women, attacking them from behind with a hammer or a pair of scissors, leaving them wounded and terrified but often, inexplicably, alive. The attacks were so random and so varied that the police were completely baffled. They didn't know if they were dealing with one man or a gang of criminals. The victims were chosen with no apparent logic. They were old women and young girls, men walking home from work, lone wanderers in the city's parks. The weapon was never the same twice. A knife, a hammer, a pair of shears, a stiletto. The only common thread was the sheer, motiveless malignity of the acts. This was not about robbery. The victim's valuables were rarely taken. This was not about settling scores. This was violence as an end in itself, a kind of dark, abstract art form being painted across the city. As the summer of 1929 bled into autumn, the fear in Dusseldorf began to coalesce into a citywide panic. The newspapers, sensing the public's growing terror, gave the phantom a name. They called him Der Würger, the Strangler, but it was another, more lurid moniker that would stick, the Vampire of Dusseldorf. The name was born from the strange, almost supernatural nature of the crimes, and from a chilling, though likely apocryphal, rumor that the killer had been seen drinking the blood of one of his victims. The name was perfect. It captured the public's sense that they were being stalked not by a man, but by a monster, a creature of the night who defied all rational explanation. The city began to change. The once bustling streets grew quiet after dark. Women refused to walk alone. Vigilante groups formed, armed with clubs and knives, patrolling their own neighborhoods. The police, under immense public pressure, were desperate. They launched one of the largest manhunts in German history. They arrested hundreds of suspects, rounding up ex-convicts, vagrants, and the mentally ill. They consulted with clairvoyants and psychics. They brought in famous homicide detectives from Berlin, including the legendary Ernst Jennat, a man known for his meticulous, scientific approach to criminology. But the vampire remained a ghost. He seemed to be taunting them, his attacks growing more frequent and more brazen as the manhunt intensified. In August, he murdered 3 more people on a single weekend. 2 young sisters, Gertrude and Louise Lenzen, and a servant girl named Gertrude Schult. The randomness continued to defy all profiling. He would attack a woman with a hammer one day and then stab a man the next. He would set a fire in one part of the city and then commit a violent assault in another miles away just hours later. He seemed to possess an uncanny ability to blend in, to disappear. He was a man without a face, a phantom who could move through the city's streets, ride its trams, and sit in its cafes, completely unnoticed. He was, as one terrified resident put it, the man next to you. This was the true source of the terror. The monster was not an outsider who had descended upon their city. He was one of them. He was a quiet neighbor, a fellow factory worker, a man who shared a beer at the local pub. He was an ordinary man who was also a monster, and the line between the two was terrifyingly, invisibly thin. The police were chasing a shadow, but the man they were looking for was, in reality, living a life of almost comically mundane respectability. His name was Peter Kürten. He was a 46-year-old factory worker, a quiet, well-mannered man who lived in a small apartment in the Mettmann district with his wife. He was a doting husband, a reliable employee, and a friendly neighbor. He was so unremarkable, so utterly ordinary, that he was beneath suspicion. He would leave his home in the morning, go to work, and then, in the evenings, he would go out hunting. He would follow the news of his own crimes with a keen, detached interest, sometimes joining the crowds that gathered at the crime scenes, listening to the terrified whispers of his neighbors, silently savoring the panic he had created. He was the ghost that haunted the city, and he was hiding in plain sight, protected by a mask of perfect, impenetrable normalcy. While the city of Dusseldorf was paralyzed by fear, and the police were chasing phantoms, Peter Kürten was meticulously refining his craft. His campaign of terror was not just a series of random, impulsive acts. It was a deeply personal, lifelong project of a man who had been steeped in violence and degradation from his earliest days. To understand the monster, one had to understand the man, and his story was a grim testament to a life defined by brutality. Born in 1883 into a world of extreme poverty and depravity, Kürten's childhood was a relentless nightmare. He was one of 13 children, and his father was a violent, abusive alcoholic who frequently beat his wife and children. The family lived in a single, squalid room, and Peter was a first-hand witness to his father's nightly assaults. His first exposure to death was when he was just a young boy, watching a dog catcher drown puppies in the Rhine. He was not horrified, he was fascinated. He began to experiment on his own, torturing and killing small animals. His descent into human violence began early. As a teenager, he claimed to have pushed a playmate into the water and watched him drown. He was sent to a reformatory, the beginning of a long and uninterrupted career as a criminal. His life became a revolving door of prisons and petty crimes. Theft, arson, desertion from the army, and assault. But beneath the surface of this life of a common criminal, a far darker and more complex set of fantasies was taking shape. He was obsessed with two things: fire and blood. He found a deep, almost sexual satisfaction in the act of arson, in the power and beauty of destruction. And he was haunted by violent sexual fantasies, daydreams of power, domination, and murder that he would nurture and cultivate for decades. His time in prison was not a period of rehabilitation. It was an incubation period. He read medical textbooks and books on criminology, studying the art of murder with the detached curiosity of a scholar. When he was released from prison for the last time in 1925, he was a changed man. The petty criminal had evolved. He settled in Dusseldorf, got married, and for a few years, he managed to suppress his violent urges, channeling his deviancy into a series of non-violent crimes like theft and arson. But by 1929, the pressure of his dark fantasies had become too much to bear. The wall he had built between his inner world and the outer one began to crumble, and the monster he had been cultivating in secret for over 30 years was finally unleashed upon the city. His year-long reign of terror was not a descent into madness. It was the methodical execution of a life's work. He was not out of control. He was in absolute control, a predator who was finally able to live out the fantasies that had sustained him for so long. He took a craftsman's pride in his work, varying his methods and his victim types to confuse the police and heighten the public's terror. He studied the police investigation with a professional interest, reading every newspaper account, and he took immense satisfaction in their incompetence. The true nature of his psychology was revealed in his interactions with his victims. He was not just a killer. He was a performer who craved an audience, even if that audience was a single, terrified victim. He would often engage his victims in conversation, sometimes walking with them for a while, lulling them into a false sense of security before striking. For those he chose to let live, the psychological torment was as much a part of the assault as the physical violence. He wanted them to know they had been in the presence of the monster and that he had spared them. This strange, almost theatrical need for recognition would ultimately be his undoing. In May of 1930, his long run of perfect, anonymous crimes came to an end because of a single careless mistake. He picked up a young housemaid named Maria Budlick, who had just arrived in the city and was looking for work. He lured her back to his apartment with the promise of a meal and a place to stay. His wife was away for the evening. Inside the apartment, he attacked her, but for some reason, he stopped short of killing her. Instead, he took her to a nearby men's hostel, bought her a meal, and let her go. Before he left her, he made a strange, boastful comment. He told her not to worry about the police, that they were looking for the killer in another part of the city. He then gave her the address of his own apartment building, telling her to destroy the piece of mail with his address on it. An act of self-incriminating bravado that seemed to defy all logic. Maria Budlick, terrified and confused, went to a friend's house. The next day, her friends saw the newspaper headlines about the hunt for the vampire of Dusseldorf and persuaded Maria to go to the police. She was able to provide them with a description of her attacker and, most crucially, the location of his apartment. The police now had a specific address, a physical anchor in the sea of chaos. But even with this information, they proceeded with caution. They didn't want to spook their suspect. They began a quiet surveillance of the apartment building. As they were watching, they got another, even more astonishing break. A letter arrived at a local newspaper. It was from a woman who claimed to know the identity of the vampire. She wrote that she had found a letter from Maria Budlick, describing the assault and giving the attacker's address. The woman who had written to the newspaper, it turned out, was Peter Kürten's own wife. The story was complex. Maria Budlick had, in fact, sent a postcard to the friend she had stayed with, detailing the assault. That postcard had been misdelivered to a pub, where it was found by a cleaning lady who happened to be a friend of Peter Kürten's wife, Frau Kürten. The cleaning lady, knowing Frau Kürten's address was the same as the one mentioned in the postcard, gave it to her. Frau Kürten confronted her husband. He did not deny it. In a calm, matter-of-fact voice, he confessed everything. Not just the assault on Maria Budlick, but all of it. The arsons, the stabbings, the murders. He confessed to being the vampire of Dusseldorf. His wife, horrified and terrified of being seen as an accomplice, went to the police, providing the final, irrefutable confirmation. The police now knew they had their man, but they still waited. On May 24, 1930, Peter Kürten was sitting in a local Catholic church. His wife, acting under police instruction, met him there. She told him that the police knew everything and that he had to turn himself in. Kürten seemed almost relieved. He agreed. He walked out of the church and calmly approached a group of police officers who were waiting for him at a nearby restaurant. "I am the man you are looking for," he said. He surrendered without a struggle. The reign of the vampire of Dusseldorf, which had held the city in its thrall for over a year, was over. The ghost had finally shown its face, and it was the face of a quiet, unassuming factory worker. The arrest of Peter Kürten sent a wave of stunned disbelief through Dusseldorf and all of Germany. The monster who had haunted their nightmares was not a shadowy creature of the night, not a wild-eyed madman, but a quiet, neatly dressed, and impeccably polite 47-year-old man. He was the friendly neighbor, the reliable co-worker, the doting husband. The revelation that the phantom and the ordinary man were one and the same was, in many ways, more terrifying than the crimes themselves. It shattered the comforting illusion that evil was something external, something easily identifiable. It suggested that the most profound darkness could hide behind the most mundane of masks. Once in custody, Curtin was not the silent, brooding killer the police had expected. He was the opposite. He was talkative, cooperative, and almost cheerful. He seemed to be reveling in the attention, basking in the spotlight that he had so long craved. He treated his interrogations less like a criminal proceeding and more like a series of academic seminars, with himself as the esteemed subject. He confessed to everything and more. The police had attributed 9 murders and dozens of assaults to the vampire. Curtin, with a calm, methodical pride, provided them with a far more extensive catalog of his life's work. He confessed to crimes stretching back decades, to arsons, assaults, and murders that the police had never solved or even connected to one another. He spoke of his crimes with a chilling, detached precision, recalling dates, locations, and the specific sensations he had experienced. He was not remorseful. He was boastful, a connoisseur of his own depravity. His confession was a journey into the darkest recesses of a psychopathic mind. He explained his motivations, his fantasies, and the intricate personal logic that guided his seemingly random acts of violence. He spoke of the profound, almost spiritual pleasure he derived from the sight of blood, a pleasure he had chased since childhood. He described the beautiful feeling of seeing a fire he had set light up the night sky. He explained that his attacks were often experiments, attempts to achieve a perfect synthesis of his 2 great obsessions, fire and blood. He recounted his attack on the young girl, Rosa Oliger, whose body he had set on fire, describing it as a successful, if ultimately disappointing, attempt to achieve this union. He also provided a chilling insight into his victim selection. He explained that there was often no logic to it at all. He would simply walk the streets, waiting for an opportunity, a moment of vulnerability. He also confessed that he would often return to his crime scenes, sometimes for days afterward, mingling with the crowds, listening to the gossip, and reliving the thrill of his own actions. He even admitted to offering his assistance to the police on one occasion, a final, audacious act of contempt for the authorities he had so easily outwitted. The interrogations were led by Professor Carl Berg, a renowned forensic psychiatrist. Berg conducted a series of long, intensive interviews with Curtin, which would form the basis of a groundbreaking and terrifying psychological profile. Curtin was, in Berg's assessment, a sexual psychopath, a man whose violent acts were inextricably linked to his deviant sexual fantasies. He was not insane in the legal sense. He knew the difference between right and wrong. He simply did not care. He possessed a profound lack of empathy, viewing other human beings not as people, but as objects, mere props in the elaborate theater of his own violent daydreams. Berg's study of Curtin would become a seminal work in the field of criminal psychology, one of the first in-depth clinical examinations of a serial killer. The trial of Peter Curtin began in April 1931, and it was a national sensation. The German public was morbidly fascinated by the man who had terrorized one of their major cities. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, psychologists, and curious onlookers, all eager to catch a glimpse of the vampire. Curtin himself seemed to enjoy the spectacle. He sat in the courtroom, calm and composed, listening intently to the testimony against him, occasionally offering polite corrections to the witnesses' accounts of his own crimes. The prosecution laid out the case against him, detailing the 9 murders and numerous assaults for which he was being tried. They presented the testimony of the survivors, including Maria Budlik, the young housemaid whose trip to the police had finally brought him down. The evidence was overwhelming, and it was made all the more powerful by Curtin's own detailed, matter-of-fact confessions. His defense attorney was left with an impossible task. He could not argue that Curtin was innocent. The man himself had admitted to everything. The only possible defense was one of insanity. The defense argued that Curtin was a product of his horrific childhood, a man so damaged by a lifetime of abuse and depravity that he could not be held fully responsible for his actions. They portrayed him as a sick man, a victim of his own uncontrollable compulsions. But Curtin himself seemed to undermine this defense at every turn. His demeanor in the courtroom was not that of a man tormented by his demons. It was that of a rational, intelligent, and disturbingly self-aware individual. He spoke of his crimes with such clarity and insight that it was impossible to see him as anything other than sane. He was a monster, but he was a thinking monster, a man who had made a conscious, lifelong choice to embrace his own darkness. The trial lasted for just over a week. The outcome was never in doubt. The jury found him guilty on all 9 counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to death by beheading. Curtin received the sentence with the same calm, almost serene, composure he had maintained throughout the trial. His reign of terror was over, and the final act of his dark, theatrical life was about to be performed. In the end, the system he had so long despised and outwitted would have the final say. The vampire of Dusseldorf was about to keep his own final appointment with the executioner. In the days leading up to his execution, Peter Curtin's strange, almost academic fascination with his own psychology did not wane. He seemed to view his impending death as the final, ultimate sensation, the last new experience in a life dedicated to the pursuit of extreme feelings. He met with the psychiatrist Professor Berg one last time, continuing to dissect his own mind with a chilling, analytical detachment. He was morbidly curious about the process of his own execution. He asked the prison officials for details about the guillotine, wanting to know if he would be able to hear the sound of his own blood gushing from his neck after the blade fell. "Tell me," he reportedly asked Berg, "after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." This final, grotesque fantasy was the ultimate expression of his life's obsession. Even in his own death, he sought to find a perverse aesthetic satisfaction, to turn his own execution into the final, bloody masterpiece of his life's work. On the morning of July 2nd, 1931, Peter Curtin was led from his cell to the execution yard at the prison in Cologne. He was calm and composed. His final meal was a traditional German one, Wiener Schnitzel with fried potatoes and a bottle of white wine, which he reportedly ate with great relish, even asking for and receiving a second helping. He walked to the guillotine without a struggle. His final words were not of remorse or of fear, but of a kind of quiet, satisfied finality. Peter Curtin, the vampire of Dusseldorf, was executed. The legacy of the Peter Curtin case was profound and multifaceted. For the city of Dusseldorf, his execution brought a sense of closure and relief, but the psychological scars of his reign of terror would linger for years. He had shattered the city's sense of security, proving that the most terrifying monsters could be the quiet, ordinary men living next door. The name Vampire of Dusseldorf entered the lexicon of crime, a permanent byword for a certain kind of predatory, motiveless evil. In the world of criminology and psychology, the case was a landmark. The meticulous study of Curtin by Professor Berg was one of the first and most detailed clinical portraits of a modern serial killer. It provided invaluable, if terrifying, insights into the development of a psychopathic personality, the role of childhood trauma, and the complex interplay of fantasy and violence. The Curtin case helped to lay the groundwork for the modern field of criminal profiling, the science of understanding the minds of those who kill not for passion or profit, but for pleasure. The story of the Vampire of Dusseldorf also became a powerful cultural artifact, most notably as the direct inspiration for Fritz Lang's masterful 1931 film, M. While the film is not a direct retelling of the Curtin case, it brilliantly captures the atmosphere of a city in the grip of a collective, paranoid terror, the frantic and incompetent police investigation, and even the involvement of the city's own criminal underworld in the hunt for the child killer. The film, released while Curtin's trial was still fresh in the public mind, tapped into the very real anxieties of Weimar Germany and transformed a local crime story into a timeless parable about society, justice, and the nature of evil. But perhaps the most enduring and unsettling legacy of the Peter Curtin case is what it revealed about the society in which it occurred. His year-long reign of terror took place at a critical, fragile moment in German history. The Weimar Republic was a society in turmoil, racked by economic instability, political extremism, and a profound sense of national humiliation in the wake of World War I. Curtin's crimes seemed to be a physical manifestation of the moral and social decay that many felt was consuming the nation. In the aftermath of his execution, the rising Nazi Party was quick to exploit the case for its own political ends. They pointed to Curtin as a symptom of the decadence and degeneracy of the liberal Weimar Republic. They argued that only a strong, authoritarian state, one willing to be ruthless in its pursuit of order, could protect the German people from such monsters. The Curtin case became a convenient piece of propaganda, a justification for the brutal, totalitarian measures they would soon implement. It is a dark and profound irony that the capture and execution of one monster was used to help pave the way for a regime that would unleash a far greater, more systematic, and more monstrous form of violence upon the world. The story of the Vampire of Dusseldorf, then, is more than just the tale of a single deranged killer. It is a story about a city, a society, and a historical moment on the brink of an abyss. It is a chilling reminder that the terror of a lone predator can sometimes be a harbinger of a much larger, more collective madness to come. Peter Curtin was a monster born from the dark, violent currents of his time, and his crimes, in retrospect, feel like a tremor before the earthquake, a terrible preview of the darkness that was about to engulf Germany and the world. The Leopold and Loeb case, the Chicago of 1924, was a city of electric, almost frantic energy. It was the heart of the Jazz Age, a place of soaring new skyscrapers, rattling elevated trains, and the clandestine thrill of speakeasies that hummed with the music of Louis Armstrong. It was a city of stark, violent contrasts, where the brutal gangsterism of Al Capone's underworld existed alongside the immense, dynastic wealth of families like the Armours, the Swifts, and the Fields. In the affluent South Side neighborhood of Kenwood, with its stately mansions and manicured lawns, life was a gilded affair, a world of debutante balls, chauffeur-driven cars, and the serene assumption of a future filled with limitless possibility. It was in this world of supreme privilege that two of its most brilliant sons were about to unleash a crime so cold, so calculated, and so intellectually perverse that it would shock the nation and forever change the way it thought about the nature of evil. Their names were Nathan Freudenthal Leopold Jr. and Richard Albert Loeb. On paper, they were the very embodiment of the American elite. Both were the sons of self-made millionaires. Both were prodigies, blessed with intellects that were almost frightening in their power. Nathan Leopold, at 19, was a law student at the prestigious University of Chicago, having already completed his undergraduate degree. He was a published ornithologist, an expert on the Kirtland's warbler, and claimed to speak 15 languages. He was quiet, socially awkward, and possessed a deep, almost obsessive intellectual arrogance. Richard Loeb, at 18, was the youngest graduate in the history of the University of Michigan. He was Leopold's opposite in temperament, handsome, charming, and effortlessly popular. He was the golden boy, the charismatic leader who seemed destined for a life of boundless success. But beneath his polished, confident exterior lay a deep-seated compulsion for thrill-seeking and a manipulative, cruel streak. Their relationship was the engine of the crime. It was an intense, toxic, and deeply unbalanced partnership. Leopold, the brooding intellectual, was completely infatuated with the charismatic Loeb, both physically and intellectually. Loeb, in turn, was intoxicated by Leopold's adoration and his willingness to be a partner in his escalating fantasies of crime. They were a two-man secret society, bound together by a shared sense of intellectual superiority and a profound contempt for the moral laws that governed what they saw as the inferior masses. This shared worldview found its philosophical justification in the writings of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, or rather, in their own twisted, juvenile interpretation of his work. They became obsessed with the concept of the Übermensch or Superman, the idea of a superior individual who exists beyond the conventional confines of good and evil, a man so intellectually evolved that he has the right to create his own morality and to act upon his will without regard for the laws that bind ordinary men. They saw themselves as these supermen. The laws of society, they believed, did not apply to them. Fueled by this toxic philosophy, they began a series of petty crimes: theft, vandalism, arson. But these small transgressions were not enough to satisfy Loeb's craving for a thrill or Leopold's desire to prove his intellectual mettle. They began to fantasize about committing the ultimate act, the one thing that would definitively prove their superiority over all of humanity. The perfect crime. The crime they envisioned was not one of passion or greed. It was a purely intellectual exercise. The goal was not personal gain, but the successful execution of a flawless, motiveless murder, an act so brilliantly planned and executed that it would baffle the police and stand as a testament to their superior intellects. For months, they meticulously planned every detail of their masterpiece. First, they needed a victim. The choice would be random, to ensure there was no personal motive for the police to trace. It would simply be a young boy from their own affluent neighborhood, someone whose family would be able to pay a ransom. The ransom, of course, was a crucial part of the misdirection, a false trail designed to make the crime look like a standard kidnapping for profit. Next, they acquired the tools. They rented a Willis Knight automobile under a false name, a car they could use for the abduction and then abandon. They purchased a chisel, which they would use as the murder weapon. They bought rope to bind the victim and hydrochloric acid to pour on the body, hoping to disfigure the face and genitals to make identification impossible. They even stole a typewriter from a fraternity house, using it to type out a complex and demanding ransom note. They also constructed a detailed, almost laughably complex, plan for the ransom drop, involving a series of coded instructions to be delivered by phone and by mail. They opened a special bank account under a pseudonym to receive the money. Every detail was planned, debated, and rehearsed. They spent nearly 7 months plotting their perfect crime. They believed they had thought of everything. On the afternoon of May 21st, 1924, Leopold and Loeb put their plan into motion. They packed their supplies into the rented car, the chisel, the rope, the acid, a blanket, and began to cruise the streets of the Kenwood neighborhood, hunting for a victim. They passed a few potential targets but rejected them for various reasons. They were looking for the perfect, isolated opportunity. As the afternoon wore on, they spotted a familiar figure walking along the sidewalk. It was 14-year-old Robert "Bobby" Franks. Bobby was Richard Loeb's second cousin and a neighbor who had often played tennis at the Loeb family's court. He was not a stranger, which violated their rule of randomness, but the opportunity was too perfect to pass up. He was alone and he knew them. Richard Loeb, leaning out of the passenger side of the car, called out to him. "Hey, Bobby," he said. "Want a ride home? I want to talk to you about that new tennis racket." Bobby Franks, seeing his older, charismatic cousin, felt no fear. He knew these boys. He trusted them. He smiled, opened the car door, and climbed into the front seat. The door closed behind him, and the Willis Knight sedan pulled away from the curb, carrying the young boy toward his doom. The two budding supermen had their victim. The first and most important part of their perfect crime was complete. The intellectual exercise was about to become a brutal, horrifying reality. As the Willis Knight sedan moved through the quiet, tree-lined streets of Kenwood, the atmosphere inside the car shifted from one of casual familiarity to one of cold, premeditated violence. With Nathan Leopold at the wheel, Richard Loeb, sitting in the back seat, raised the chisel. Without a word, he struck Bobby Franks in the head 4 times with brutal, crushing force. The attack was swift and merciless. The boy was likely killed almost instantly. They quickly pulled a blanket over his body to conceal him from view and then began the next phase of their meticulously planned operation. They drove for hours, waiting for darkness to fall, the body of their young victim lying on the floor of the car. They stopped for a meal, a surreal and chilling detail, eating hot dogs and root beer while their victim lay dead just a few feet away. As night descended, they drove south of the city to a remote, swampy area near the Indiana border, a desolate patch of marshland known as Hegewisch. This was the spot they had scouted for the disposal of the body. Under the cover of darkness, they dragged Bobby Franks's small body from the car. They stripped him of his clothes, and then, in a grim adherence to their plan, they poured hydrochloric acid on his face and genitals, hoping to obscure his identity. They shoved his body into a culvert, a concrete drainage pipe that ran under the railroad tracks, believing it would be hidden from view indefinitely. They then drove back to Chicago, their grisly work done. The second part of their plan was the misdirection. That evening, they called the Franks family, who were by now frantic with worry. Using a disguised voice, Leopold informed them that their son had been kidnapped and that a ransom note would be forthcoming. The next morning, they mailed the typed ransom note they had so carefully prepared, demanding $10,000 and providing a complex set of instructions for the drop. They then went about their day, Leopold attending his law classes and Loeb playing cards, the two of them basking in the secret, arrogant thrill of their intellectual triumph. They believed they had committed the perfect crime. But the perfect crime began to unravel almost immediately, undone not by a brilliant piece of police work, but by a series of small, careless mistakes and a single, stunning stroke of bad luck. The first flaw in their plan was the location they had chosen to hide the body. The culvert was not as remote or as secure as they had believed. The very next day, a Polish immigrant worker, walking along the railroad tracks, noticed something pale in the mouth of the drainage pipe. He peered closer and saw the body of a young boy. He immediately notified the police. Before the Franks family had even begun to follow the complex ransom instructions, their son's body had been found. The kidnapping plot, the central piece of their misdirection, had been rendered completely irrelevant. The police were now investigating a murder, not a kidnapping. And while the body was disfigured, it was not unidentifiable. Dental records quickly confirmed that the victim was 14-year-old Bobby Franks. The news of the murder of a prominent family's son sent a shockwave through Chicago. The press descended on the story with a ravenous intensity, dubbing it the crime of the century. The police investigation began, and almost immediately, they found a clue, a single critical piece of evidence that the two budding supermen had somehow overlooked. Lying in the mud and reeds just a few feet from where the body had been found was a pair of eyeglasses. They were not ordinary glasses. They had distinctive horn-rimmed frames and, most importantly, a unique patented hinge mechanism. It was a hinge that had been sold to only 3 customers in the entire city of Chicago. This was the kind of clue that a meticulous planner would never have missed. But in the darkness and the rush to dispose of the body, the glasses had fallen unnoticed from Nathan Leopold's pocket. The police traced the hinge to an optometrist in downtown Chicago. The optometrist checked his records. One of the 3 pairs had been sold to a lawyer. The second belonged to a woman. The third pair had been sold to a young, brilliant university student named Nathan Leopold. Suddenly, the police had a suspect. But at first, it seemed impossible. Leopold was from a wealthy, respected family. He was a law student, a budding intellectual. He seemed to have no motive whatsoever. When the police brought him in for questioning, he was calm, confident, and almost contemptuous. He claimed that he must have lost his glasses while on one of his frequent bird-watching expeditions in the Hegewisch area. It was a plausible, if convenient, explanation. While Leopold was being questioned, the police were also looking at Richard Loeb. As a cousin of the victim, he was brought in for routine questioning as well. Like Leopold, he was the picture of cool composure, offering his assistance to the police and expressing his shock and sadness over his cousin's death. The two friends had coordinated their alibis perfectly. They claimed they had spent the entire day of the murder together, driving around in Leopold's car, picking up girls. For a time, it seemed their story might hold. But the police were persistent. They began to question the two friends separately, for hours on end, looking for any inconsistency, any crack in their carefully constructed facade. The pressure mounted. They questioned the Leopold family's chauffeur, who contradicted a key detail of their alibi, stating that Leopold's car had been in the family garage all day and that he had been washing it. The cracks began to show. The two friends, who had been so certain of their intellectual superiority, began to turn on each other. Under the relentless pressure of the interrogation, it was Richard Loeb, the charismatic leader, who broke first. He confessed everything. But in his confession, he painted himself as the reluctant accomplice, the pawn in a scheme masterminded by the dominant, manipulative Nathan Leopold. He claimed that Leopold was the one who had killed Bobby Franks in the back of the car, while he, Loeb, had merely been the driver. When the police presented Leopold with Loeb's confession, he was stunned and enraged. He saw Loeb's story as a profound betrayal, a cowardly attempt to shift the blame. In a fit of anger, he gave his own confession. But in his version, the roles were reversed. He claimed that it was Richard Loeb, the thrill-seeker, who was the true architect of the crime, the one who had struck the fatal blows, while he, Leopold, had just been the driver. The two supermen, who had believed themselves to be so far above the petty emotions of ordinary men, had been brought down by the most common human failings: carelessness, panic, and betrayal. The confessions were a national sensation. The idea that these two wealthy, privileged, and brilliant young men had murdered a child for no other reason than the intellectual thrill of it was a concept that America could barely comprehend. The perfect crime had been revealed to be a clumsy, arrogant, and ultimately pathetic act of adolescent nihilism. The case now moved from the interrogation room to the courtroom, where the nation would be forced to confront the terrifying question of what could possibly motivate such a monstrous and seemingly motiveless crime. The confessions of Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb ignited a media firestorm unlike any the nation had ever seen. The story had every element of a grand, tragic opera: immense wealth, prodigious intellect, a shocking crime, and a motive so perverse and so alien that it seemed to defy all human understanding. The press dubbed them the boy murderers, and the public was morbidly fascinated. The case became a national obsession, a dark parable about the soullessness of the modern age, the dangers of wealth, and the corrupting influence of new, radical ideas. With two full confessions, the question of their guilt was not in doubt. The case seemed destined for a swift trial and an even swifter trip to the gallows. The state of Illinois had the death penalty, and public sentiment was overwhelmingly in favor of executing the two young men who had murdered a child for sport. The prosecutor, State's Attorney Robert E. Crowe, was confident. He had the confessions, the physical evidence, and the full force of public outrage behind him. He fully expected to secure a death sentence. Faced with this seemingly hopeless situation, the wealthy Leopold and Loeb families did the only thing they could. They hired the most famous and most formidable defense attorney in America. His name was Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow was a living legend. At 67 years old, he was a towering figure in American law, a brilliant, rumpled, and deeply compassionate lawyer known for his passionate opposition to the death penalty and his defense of the underdog. He had famously defended the radical labor leader Eugene V. Debs and, just a year later, would go on to argue for the cause of evolution in the famous Scopes monkey trial. He was a master courtroom orator, a shrewd legal tactician, and a profound student of human psychology. He was, in short, the last best hope for two boys who seemed to have no hope at all. Darrow knew that a traditional jury trial was unwinnable. A jury of ordinary citizens would be so horrified by the nature of the crime that they would almost certainly vote for execution. So he made a brilliant and highly unusual legal maneuver. He had his clients plead guilty. By pleading guilty to murder and kidnapping, Leopold and Loeb waived their right to a jury trial. The case would now be decided by a single judge, who would be responsible for determining their sentence. Darrow was gambling that he could appeal to the reason and intellect of a single, experienced judge in a way he never could with a jury swayed by emotion and outrage. The sentencing hearing, which began in the summer of 1924, was not a trial of guilt or innocence, but a trial of the mind. It became a groundbreaking, head-on collision between the old world of retributive justice and the new, emerging world of psychology and psychiatry. Darrow's entire strategy was to argue against the death penalty. He would not argue that his clients were innocent, but that they were not fully responsible for their actions. His goal was to save their lives by explaining their crime, by delving into the dark, twisted psychological landscape that had led two brilliant young men to commit such a monstrous act. To do this, he assembled a team of pioneering alienists, the term for psychiatrists at the time, to examine Leopold and Loeb. These mind doctors conducted extensive interviews and psychological tests, probing the boys' family histories, their strange, obsessive relationship, and their private fantasies. They built a complex psychological portrait of two deeply disturbed, if intellectually brilliant, young men. The defense presented a picture of Nathan Leopold as a boy who, despite his immense intellect, was emotionally stunted, a social outcast who was physically and emotionally dominated by his governess as a child. His obsession with Richard Loeb, they argued, was a desperate, pathological attempt to find the connection and acceptance he had always craved. Richard Loeb, the charming golden boy, was revealed to be a young man trapped in a prison of his own making, dominated by a governess who instilled in him a sense of shame and worthlessness. He had developed a rich, elaborate fantasy life as a way to escape. In his fantasies, he was a master criminal, a brilliant detective, the hero of his own pulp novels. His real-life crimes were, the alienists argued, a desperate attempt to bring these fantasies to life, to prove his own worth and power. He was not a cold-blooded killer, but a deeply insecure boy playing a deadly game. Darrow argued that the crime was not the product of two separate, evil minds, but of a single, toxic, fantasy partnership. Each boy, he claimed, was the other's fatal alter ego. Leopold's obsessive devotion fed Loeb's need for an audience, and Loeb's criminal fantasies gave Leopold a way to participate in a shared, secret world. Separately, they might have been nothing more than troubled, arrogant young men, but together they had created a feedback loop of delusion and obsession that had spiraled into murder. The prosecution, led by Robert Crowe, vehemently rejected this psychological defense. He ridiculed the alienists and their million-dollar defense, portraying it as a cynical attempt by wealthy families to use pseudoscientific jargon to excuse the inexcusable. He argued that the boys were not sick. They were evil. They were moral lepers who had been given every advantage in life and had chosen to commit a cold, calculated, and heartless crime. He read their confessions aloud, emphasizing their lack of remorse, their intellectual arrogance, and the brutal details of the murder. He appealed to the judge's sense of justice and to the outrage of the community, demanding the ultimate penalty for the ultimate crime. "This is a crime," Crowe declared, "that the hangman's rope was made for." The hearing lasted for over a month. The courtroom was a battlefield of ideas, a debate over the very nature of human responsibility. Was crime a product of free will, a conscious choice to do evil? Or was it the result of a complex web of psychological, biological, and environmental factors beyond an individual's control? The fate of two young men hung in the balance, and the entire nation was watching, waiting for the judge to decide whether to show mercy to two boys who had shown none themselves. The climax of the hearing would be Clarence Darrow's closing argument, a speech that would become one of the most famous and powerful indictments of capital punishment in American history. The final act of the sensational hearing came on a sweltering August day in 1924. Clarence Darrow, rumpled and weary, rose to deliver his closing argument. He spoke for 12 hours over the course of 2 days. It was not a speech aimed at proving innocence, but a profound, passionate, and deeply philosophical plea for mercy. It was the summation of his life's work, a powerful and eloquent argument against the death penalty itself. He began not by excusing his clients, but by acknowledging the horror of their crime. "I do not know how much salvage there is in these two boys," he admitted. "I will be honest with this court and say that I have been brooding over this case for 3 months, and I have not been able to find a motive." He then pivoted, turning the very motivelessness of the crime into the heart of his defense. An act so senseless, so contrary to all human emotion, could not, he argued, be the product of a healthy mind. It had to be the product of a diseased one. He painstakingly walked the judge through the psychological profiles that his team of alienists had constructed. He spoke of the boys' stunted emotional development, their isolation, their toxic, codependent relationship, and their obsession with the dangerous, half-understood philosophy of Nietzsche. Is there any blame attached because somebody took Nietzsche's philosophy seriously and fashioned his life upon it? Darrow asked. It is hardly fair to hang a 19-year-old boy for the philosophy that was taught him at the university. He was, in a brilliant rhetorical move, putting not just his clients on trial, but the entire intellectual and emotional environment that had produced them. His voice cracking with emotion, he argued that to hang these two boys would be an act of vengeance, not justice. It would be a surrender to the base, primal emotions of the public, an act of bloodlust. He implored the judge, John R. Caverly, to rise above the public outcry and to make a decision based on reason, on science, and on a more enlightened understanding of human behavior. He argued that the state, in its wisdom and its progress, should be moving away from the barbaric practice of capital punishment, especially when the defendants were so young. His final plea was a direct, emotional appeal to the judge's own humanity. "I am pleading for the future," he said, his voice dropping to an almost reverent whisper. "I am pleading for a time when hatred and cruelty will not control the hearts of men, when we can learn by reason and judgment and understanding and faith that all life is worth saving, and that mercy is the highest attribute of man. I am pleading for the life of these two boys." He concluded, exhausted, and the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Darrow had delivered the argument of his life. 10 days later, on September 10th, 1924, Judge Caverly delivered his verdict. The courtroom was packed, the city on edge. He began by condemning the crime in the harshest possible terms. But then he turned to the question of the sentence. He acknowledged the power of Darrow's arguments and the findings of the psychiatrists. He stated that because of the defendant's youth, both were under 21, and because they had pleaded guilty, he felt compelled to show mercy. He sentenced both Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb to life in prison for the murder, plus an additional 99 years for the kidnapping. Clarence Darrow had won. He had saved the lives of the two most hated boys in America. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief from the families and outrage from the public, but it stood as a landmark moment in American legal history, a testament to the power of a single, brilliant defense to turn the tide against overwhelming public sentiment. The two boy murderers were sent to the Stateville Penitentiary in Joliet, Illinois. Their intellectual partnership, which had been the engine of their crime, soon dissolved in the harsh reality of prison life. Richard Loeb, the charismatic golden boy, was never able to adjust. His charm and arrogance did not play well with the other inmates. In 1936, at the age of 30, he was attacked in a prison shower by a fellow inmate and was slashed to death with a straight razor. Nathan Leopold, on the other hand, found a new kind of purpose in prison. He became a model prisoner. He reorganized the prison library, taught other inmates to read, and worked in the prison hospital. He wrote a memoir, Life Plus 99 Years, and became a vocal advocate for prison reform. After 33 years behind bars, in 1958, Nathan Leopold, the man who had once believed himself to be a Superman above all laws, was granted parole. He moved to Puerto Rico, where he married, earned a master's degree, and worked as a hospital technician and a researcher on leprosy. He dedicated the rest of his life to quiet service, a long, humble penance for the arrogant, monstrous act of his youth. He died of a heart attack in 1971 at the age of 66. The Leopold and Loeb case endures as a powerful and unsettling parable. It has been the inspiration for numerous plays, books, and films, most famously Alfred Hitchcock's 1948 masterpiece, Rope. The story continues to fascinate and horrify because it raises fundamental questions about the nature of good and evil, the sources of criminal behavior, and the limits of human justice. It is a story that peeled back the placid surface of a privileged world to reveal a profound and terrifying emptiness, and it serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that the capacity for the most inhuman acts does not always spring from poverty or ignorance, but can sometimes be born in the brilliant, twisted, and dangerously arrogant minds of those who have been given every advantage in the world. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study in the heart of the American South, in the year 1932, Macon County, Alabama, was a place largely untouched by the promises of the 20th century. It was a landscape of deep, rural poverty, a place of unpainted sharecropper shacks, dusty cotton fields, and a rigid social order defined by the long, dark shadow of Jim Crow. For the county's black population, life was a daily struggle for survival against a backdrop of systemic racism, economic exploitation, and a profound lack of access to even the most basic services, including healthcare. It was in this isolated and vulnerable community that the United States government would launch an experiment so monstrous in its deception, so profound in its ethical depravity, that its name would become a permanent byword for the abuse of medical authority and the betrayal of public trust. The story began not with malevolent intent, but with a legitimate public health crisis. In the late 1920s, a survey funded by the philanthropic Rosenwald Fund revealed a staggering rate of syphilis infection among the black men of Macon County. Nearly 35% of the population was afflicted. Syphilis at the time was a devastating disease. In its early stages, it was treatable, though the treatments themselves, involving toxic heavy metals like arsenic and mercury, were arduous and often dangerous. But if left untreated, the disease would progress through a series of horrifying stages, leading to blindness, deafness, severe mental illness, heart disease, paralysis, and eventually, a slow, agonizing death. The U.S. Public Health Service, USPHS, in collaboration with the Rosenwald Fund, initially set up a program in Macon County to treat the infected men. For a brief period, this program operated as intended, offering the best available, if imperfect, treatments to a community that had never before seen a doctor. But in 1929, the stock market crashed, plunging the nation into the Great Depression. The philanthropic funds from the Rosenwald Fund dried up, and the treatment program was shuttered. For the researchers at the USPHS, the abrupt end of the treatment program presented what they saw as a unique and unprecedented opportunity. Since the 18th century, scientists had wanted to document the full, natural progression of untreated syphilis in the human male, but doing so was ethically impossible. A doctor's first duty is to treat, not to observe. But here, in the poverty-stricken backwoods of Macon County, was what they described in their internal memos as a ready-made laboratory. They had a large group of men, already infected, who were too poor and uneducated to seek treatment on their own. They made a fateful and secretly a monstrous decision. They would no longer treat the men. They would simply watch them die. The new study was officially titled the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. Its purpose was to observe, from infection to autopsy, the devastating long-term effects of the disease. To do this, they needed to recruit subjects and to keep them enrolled for what they planned to be a study lasting not months, but decades. They needed the trust and cooperation of the very men they were deliberately deceiving. The recruitment began in 1932. The USPHS enlisted the help of the prestigious Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University, a respected black college, to lend an air of legitimacy and trust to the project. They recruited a total of 600 black men from Macon County, 399 who had latent syphilis, and a control group of 201 men who were free of the disease. The method of recruitment was a calculated, cruel deception. The men were not told they had syphilis. They were told they had bad blood, a vague, colloquial term used in the community to describe a host of ailments, from anemia to fatigue, and they were told that the United States government, in its benevolence, had selected them for a special program that would provide them with free medical care. Flyers were distributed around the county, promising free blood test, free treatment by county health department and government doctors. At the center of this deception was a figure who is one of the most complex and tragic in the entire saga. A black public health nurse named Eunice Rivers. Nurse Rivers was a respected and beloved figure in the Macon County community. She was the friendly, reassuring face of the study, the bridge of trust between the white government doctors and the poor, illiterate sharecroppers they were studying. She drove the men to their appointments, provided them with transportation, and served them hot meals on examination days. The men trusted her implicitly. She was one of them, but she was also a witting participant in the lie. She knew the men were not being treated, yet her job was to ensure they remained in the study, to track them down when they missed an appointment, and to maintain the illusion that they were receiving care. The treatments the men received were a cruel sham. They were given worthless placebos, like aspirin and mineral supplements, which they were told were medicine for their bad blood. The most invasive and painful procedure they were subjected to was the spinal tap, a diagnostic test to check for neurosyphilis. This procedure, which involves inserting a long needle into the spinal canal, was presented to the men as a special free treatment. To entice them to undergo this agonizing procedure, the USPHS sent them a letter that was a masterpiece of misleading paternalism. Last call for special free treatment. It read, "The government is giving you this last chance to get a second examination. This examination is a very special one. Remember, this is your last chance for special treatment. With the participants successfully enrolled, the study began its long, quiet, and deadly work. The men were subjected to periodic physical examinations, blood tests, and x-rays. But this was not for the purpose of healing them. It was for the purpose of data collection. The doctors from the USPHS would travel down to Alabama, observe the slow, devastating progression of the disease in their subjects, take their notes, and then leave. The men's blindness, their heart failure, their descent into madness. It was all just data for the study's grim ledger. As a final incentive to keep the families involved, the USPHS offered a burial stipend, a payment of $50 to the family of a deceased participant, on the condition that they consent to an autopsy. The study was designed to follow these men not just to the grave, but beyond it. The scientific opportunity would only be complete when the final subject had died and his ravaged organs could be examined. The Great Deception was underway, a 40-year experiment that would sacrifice generations of black men on the altar of a so-called science that was nothing more than a morbid, racist curiosity. As the Tuskegee study moved from the 1930s into the 1940s, a medical revolution occurred that should have immediately and unequivocally ended the experiment. In 1943, the antibiotic penicillin was discovered to be a safe, effective, and near-miraculous cure for syphilis. A simple course of injections could halt the progression of the disease and prevent the devastating late-stage complications that the Public Health Service was so meticulously observing. The development of penicillin was a landmark moment in the history of medicine, a triumph of science over a disease that had plagued humanity for centuries. For the men in the Tuskegee study, it should have been a lifeline. The government, which had been studying them for over a decade, now had a cure in its hands. The ethical imperative was absolute. The study should have been terminated, and every infected man should have been given the life-saving treatment they had been promised from the very beginning. But the researchers at the USPHS made a second, even more monstrous decision. They chose to withhold the cure. The rationale for this decision was laid out in a series of cold, detached internal memos. The researchers argued that the study was now too valuable to be stopped. They had invested years of work and had a unique, never-to-be-repeated opportunity to observe the long-term, untreated course of the disease. To treat the men now, they argued, would spoil the study. The scientific purity of their data was deemed more important than the lives and health of the 399 black men who were their subjects. The study, which had begun as an exercise in passive, deceptive observation, now became an active, deliberate effort to prevent the men from receiving a cure. The lengths to which the USPHS went to deny the men treatment were systematic and deeply insidious. When the United States entered World War II, many of the men in the study were drafted into the armed forces. As part of their induction, all soldiers were given a mandatory blood test for syphilis. When the men from the Tuskegee study tested positive, they were supposed to be treated with penicillin, as was standard military protocol. To prevent this, the USPHS secretly intervened. They provided the local draft board with a list of the names of all 256 men in the study who were eligible for the draft. These men were then deliberately excluded from service, ensuring they would not receive the cure that was being given to every other soldier. After the war, the USPHS continued its campaign of obstruction. They worked with the Alabama State Health Department to ensure that none of the men in the study would ever accidentally be treated. The names of the subjects were placed on a special do not treat list that was circulated to doctors and clinics throughout the state. If one of the men went to a doctor for some other ailment, and that doctor diagnosed him with syphilis, the USPHS would be alerted and would step in to prevent the treatment. They would tell the local doctors that the men were already part of a special government treatment program and should not be interfered with. It was a lie built upon a lie, a conspiracy of deception that now involved not just the federal government, but state and local health officials as well. The study continued its quiet, deadly work through the 1950s and into the 1960s. The men grew older. Their bodies began to break down. They went blind. They suffered from heart failure. They developed crippling neurological disorders. Their wives contracted the disease from them, and some of their children were born with congenital syphilis, a devastating condition that can cause blindness, deafness, and severe developmental problems. The disease was not just destroying the men, it was destroying their families, a ripple effect of suffering that spread through the community. And all the while, the USPHS doctors continued their periodic examinations, collecting their data, publishing their findings in prestigious medical journals, and congratulating themselves on their important contribution to science. The study's continued existence through this period is a profound testament to the power of institutional inertia and the deep-seated racism that made it possible. In 1947, the Nuremberg Code was established in the wake of the horrific medical experiments conducted by the Nazis. The code laid out a new set of ethical principles for human experimentation, with the first and most important principle being the voluntary, informed consent of the human subject. The Tuskegee study was in flagrant, absolute violation of this principle. The men had not given their consent, and they were certainly not informed. Yet, the study continued, uninspected and unquestioned by the wider medical community. Even as the civil rights movement was transforming the American South in the 1960s, challenging the very foundations of the Jim Crow system that had allowed the study to begin, the experiment in Macon County continued unabated. The world was changing, but in the quiet, isolated world of the study, time stood still. The doctors and nurses, including Nurse Eunice Rivers, continued their work, their roles so normalized, their mission so deeply embedded in the bureaucracy of the public health service, that the profound moral horror of what they were doing seemed to be completely invisible to them. But by the late 1960s, the first glimmers of dissent began to emerge from within the system. A young social scientist and epidemiologist at the Public Health Service in San Francisco named Peter Buxton learned of the study's existence. He was horrified. He could not believe that such an experiment was still being conducted in modern America. In 1966 and again in 1968, he sent letters to the director of the Division of Venereal Diseases, expressing his grave moral and ethical concerns. He argued that the study was a ghastly mistake and a moral nightmare. His concerns were dismissed. The USPHS convened a panel to review the study, but the panel consisted of the very same doctors and officials who had been running it for years. Unsurprisingly, they concluded that the study was still valuable and should be continued until all the subjects had died and been autopsied. Peter Buxton's internal protests had failed. He was a lone voice of conscience in a system that was deaf to its own moral corruption. He realized that if he was going to stop the study, he would have to go outside the system. He would have to go to the press. The 40-year secret was about to be exposed to the light of day. By the early 1970s, the Tuskegee study had been running in the shadows for 4 decades. It had survived the discovery of penicillin, the establishment of the Nuremberg Code, and the profound social upheavals of the civil rights movement. It was a testament to the power of bureaucratic inertia and the silence of a medical establishment that had, for generations, either tacitly approved of the study or willfully ignored its existence. But the secret was living on borrowed time. Peter Buxton, the Public Health Service employee who had tried and failed to stop the study from within, finally decided that his conscience would not allow him to remain silent any longer. In 1972, Buxton took a courageous and career-threatening step. He contacted a journalist. He reached out to Jean Heller, a young, tenacious investigative reporter with the Associated Press. He told her the story, laying out the entire horrifying history of the experiment. The deceptive recruitment, the withholding of the cure, the 40 years of deliberate neglect. Heller, at first, was incredulous. The story seemed too monstrous to be true, but as Buxton provided her with the names, the dates, and the internal documents, she realized she was on the verge of uncovering one of the most profound scandals in American history. She began her own investigation, corroborating Buxton's account with her own sources. She spoke with officials at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, in Atlanta, which had inherited oversight of the study from the USPHS. The officials she spoke to were defensive and evasive, but they did not deny the study's existence. Their justifications were a chilling echo of the memos from the 1940s. The study was scientifically valuable, and it was too late to treat the men anyway, as the damage from the disease was already irreversible. On the morning of July 25, 1972, Jean Heller's story broke. It appeared on the front page of the New York Times and was carried by the Associated Press to newspapers across the country and around the world. The headline was stark and unambiguous. Syphilis victims in U.S. study went untreated for 40 years. The public reaction was one of immediate and overwhelming shock, horror, and revulsion. The story was a gut punch to the nation's self-image. This was not something that was supposed to happen in America. It sounded like something out of a totalitarian regime, a Nazi medical experiment, not a study conducted by the United States government. The story dominated the news for weeks. The public was horrified by the details. The bad blood deception, the painful, fake treatments of the spinal taps, and most of all, the deliberate withholding of penicillin for nearly 30 years. The political fallout was swift and severe. Members of Congress expressed their outrage and demanded an immediate investigation. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW, which oversaw the Public Health Service, was plunged into a full-blown crisis. Faced with a tidal wave of public condemnation, the Assistant Secretary for Health and Scientific Affairs, Dr. Merlin Duval, announced the immediate termination of the Tuskegee study. After 40 years of secrecy, the longest non-therapeutic experiment on human beings in medical history was finally over. But the end of the study was just the beginning of the reckoning. HEW appointed an ad hoc advisory panel to investigate the history and ethics of the experiment. The panel's public hearings were a painful and damning exercise in institutional soul-searching. They heard testimony from the government doctors who had run the study, many of whom remained defiant, still trying to justify their work on scientific grounds. And they heard, for the first time, from the men themselves. The surviving subjects of the study, who were now old, frail, and still largely unaware of the full scope of the deception that had been perpetrated upon them, were finally told the truth. The government doctors they had trusted, the friendly Nurse Rivers who had driven them to their appointments, they had not been helping them. They had been using them as human guinea pigs. Their bad blood was syphilis, a disease for which a cure had existed for decades. The sense of betrayal was profound and absolute. Charlie Pollard, one of the survivors, summed up the feeling of many. "We were just pigs they were experimenting on," he said. In 1973, the advisory panel released its final report. It condemned the Tuskegee study in the strongest possible terms, calling it ethically unjustified from its very beginning. The report concluded that the study was riddled with racism, that the men's consent was not informed, and that the decision to withhold penicillin was utterly indefensible. The report was a complete and total repudiation of the scientific and ethical rationale that had sustained the experiment for 40 years. The legal consequences followed soon after. A civil rights attorney named Fred Gray, who was famous for his work representing Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., filed a class-action lawsuit on behalf of the men in the study and their families. The lawsuit charged the U.S. government with negligence, deceit, and a violation of the men's constitutional rights. The government, facing a near-certain defeat in court, chose to settle. In 1974, they agreed to a $10 million out-of-court settlement, the equivalent of more than $50 million today. The money was to be distributed among the survivors and the families of those who had died. As part of the settlement, the government also agreed to provide free, lifetime medical and burial services to all the living participants, as well as their wives, widows, and children. By the time the study was terminated, the human cost was staggering. Of the original 399 men with syphilis, at least 28 had died directly from the disease. Another 100 had died from related complications. At least 40 of their wives had been infected, and 19 of their children had been born with congenital syphilis. And beyond the numbers was a legacy of profound, immeasurable suffering. The years of pain, the blindness, the mental decline, the quiet shame, and the deep, corrosive sense of betrayal. The study had not just destroyed bodies. It had destroyed trust, creating a wound in the heart of the community that would take generations to heal. The legacy of the Tuskegee syphilis study is one of the most profound and painful in the annals of American medicine and public health. The revelations of 1972 did more than just end a single, unethical experiment. They forced a fundamental and long overdue reckoning with the ethics of human experimentation in the United States. The scandal became a powerful catalyst for change, leading directly to a complete overhaul of the regulations governing research on human subjects. In the wake of the Tuskegee Report, Congress passed the National Research Act of 1974. This landmark piece of legislation established the modern framework for the ethical treatment of human research participants. It created the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, which was tasked with identifying the basic ethical principles that should underlie all such research. The Commission's final report, known as the Belmont Report, laid out 3 core principles that are now the bedrock of research ethics. Respect for persons, which requires informed consent. Beneficence, the principle of do no harm and maximizing benefits while minimizing risks. And justice, which demands the fair and equitable distribution of the risks and benefits of research. The National Research Act also mandated the creation of institutional review boards, or IRBs, at any institution that receives federal funding for research. These boards, composed of scientists, ethicists, and community members, are now required to review and approve all proposed research involving human subjects, ensuring that it adheres to the strict ethical guidelines laid out in the Belmont Report. The entire system of modern research oversight, a system designed to protect the vulnerable from the potential abuses of scientific ambition, was born directly from the ashes of the Tuskegee study. But the most enduring and most damaging legacy of the Tuskegee experiment was not institutional. It was cultural. For the African American community, the study became a symbol of a long and painful history of medical racism and exploitation. It confirmed the deepest, most well-founded fears of a community that had been subjected to centuries of abuse at the hands of the medical establishment. From the brutal experiments on enslaved women by J. Marion Sims, the so-called father of modern gynecology, to the forced sterilizations of the eugenics era, Tuskegee was not an aberration. It was a particularly horrific and well-documented example of a pattern. The story was passed down through generations, becoming a cautionary tale, a powerful piece of oral history that bred a deep and persistent distrust of doctors, hospitals, and the public health system in general. This Tuskegee effect, as it came to be known, had real, measurable, and devastating consequences. Studies have shown that the legacy of the experiment contributed to a significant decline in the willingness of Black Americans to participate in clinical trials, to seek preventative medical care, and to trust the advice of public health officials. This distrust has been a major factor in the stark racial health disparities that persist in the United States to this day, a tragic, self-perpetuating cycle of fear and neglect that was set in motion by the deceptions of 1932. This legacy was thrown into sharp relief decades later, during the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 90s, and again during the COVID-19 pandemic, where public health officials struggled to overcome the deep-seated skepticism in the Black community, a skepticism rooted directly in the memory of Tuskegee. In 1997, 25 years after the study was exposed, the nation took a significant step toward acknowledging this painful legacy. At a ceremony in the White House, President Bill Clinton issued a formal public apology on behalf of the United States government. He was joined by 5 of the 8 remaining survivors of the study, now elderly men in their 80s and 90s. "What was done cannot be undone," President Clinton stated, his voice somber. "But we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful. And I am sorry to our African American citizens. I am sorry that your federal government orchestrated a study so racist in its nature." The apology was a powerful and necessary moment of national catharsis. It was a formal acknowledgement of the government's wrongdoing and a validation of the pain and betrayal felt by the victims and their families for generations. A presidential bioethics commission was also established to ensure that such an atrocity could never happen again. The story of the Tuskegee syphilis study serves as one of history's most potent and chilling warnings. It is a testament to the profound danger of unchecked authority, the seductive allure of scientific progress, and the ease with which systemic racism can dehumanize an entire population, turning people into data points on a ledger. It reveals how ordinary, educated people, working within an institutional framework, can become witting participants in an act of profound and prolonged evil. their moral compass slowly eroded by the normalization of the unthinkable. The last survivor of the Tuskegee study died in 2004, but the ghost of the experiment endures. It is a permanent stain on the honor of American medicine and a sorrowful reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, when divorced from a fundamental respect for human dignity, can lead to the darkest of places. It forces us to remain vigilant, to constantly question the systems of power that govern our lives, and to remember the faces and the names of the 600 black men from Macon County, Alabama, whose quiet suffering became a terrible and unforgettable lesson for a nation. The Ruby Ridge standoff in the remote, wild panhandle of northern Idaho. There is a mountain ridge that cuts a sharp, timbered line against the vast, empty sky. It is a place of rugged, almost severe beauty, a landscape of dense pine forests, deep valleys, and a profound, isolating silence. The nearest town is a speck on the map. This is a land for those who wish to be left alone, a place to escape the noise and the compromises of the modern world. In the 1980s, one family sought out this isolation not just as a preference, but as a prophecy. They built a small, rough-hewn cabin on this mountain, which they called Ruby Ridge, believing it would be their sanctuary, a fortress where they could wait out the coming apocalypse. But their fortress would become a tomb, and their search for separation would lead to a violent, tragic confrontation that would become a rallying cry for a generation of anti-government extremists and a permanent scar on the conscience of federal law enforcement. The patriarch of the family was a man named Randall "Randy" Weaver. He was not a simple backwoods recluse. A former Green Beret in the U.S. Army, Weaver was a skilled soldier, an expert in survival and guerrilla tactics. But after leaving the military, he had grown increasingly disillusioned with the world around him. This disillusionment was nurtured and given a powerful ideological framework by his wife, Vicky. Vicky Weaver was the true spiritual and intellectual driver of the family. A deeply religious woman, she had become convinced that the world was on the verge of an apocalyptic final judgment. Her beliefs were a unique, homespun blend of fundamentalist Christianity and white separatist ideology. She believed that the U.S. government was a corrupt, tyrannical entity, a Zionist-occupied government, or ZOG, that was secretly controlled by a cabal of international bankers and Jewish interests. She taught her family that the end was near, and that God had commanded them to separate themselves from this corrupt Babylon and find a refuge in the mountains, a place where they could defend themselves when the final, violent tribulation began. In the mid-1980s, the Weavers sold their home in Iowa and, with their 3 young daughters and infant son, moved to northern Idaho. They bought 20 acres of land on the remote Ruby Ridge and began to build their sanctuary. It was a small, plywood cabin, lacking electricity and running water, a primitive shelter against the harsh mountain winters. They lived a life of extreme self-sufficiency and isolation. The children were homeschooled by Vicky, their education centered on the Bible and her own apocalyptic theology. They hunted for their food, grew their own vegetables, and had minimal contact with the outside world. To their few neighbors, they were strange but largely harmless, a family of religious zealots who just wanted to be left alone. But in this isolated, paranoid world, their beliefs began to harden. Randy Weaver started attending meetings of the Aryan Nations, a notorious white supremacist and neo-Nazi organization based in nearby Hayden Lake. While Weaver would later claim he was not a true believer in their racist ideology, but was merely looking for people who shared his anti-government views, these associations put him squarely on the radar of federal law enforcement. The agency that first took an interest in him was the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF. The ATF, looking for a way to infiltrate the Aryan Nations, saw Weaver as a potential informant. In 1989, they sent an undercover informant to befriend him. The informant began to talk to Weaver about firearms, and eventually, he pressured Weaver into sawing off the barrels of 2 shotguns to a length that was just slightly shorter than the legal limit of 18 inches. The informant then bought the illegal weapons from Weaver for a couple $100. The ATF now had their leverage. They confronted Weaver and gave him an ultimatum. He could either cooperate with them and become an informant, using his Green Beret background to infiltrate the Aryan Nations and gather intelligence on their activities, or he would be arrested on federal firearms charges. For Randy Weaver, This was the ultimate confirmation of all of Vicky's darkest prophecies. The corrupt, tyrannical ZOG had come for him. They were not just investigating him. They were trying to entrap him, to force him to betray his own principles and become a spy for the very system they had fled. He refused to cooperate. He told the agents to leave him alone. True to their word, the ATF pursued the firearms charges. In early 1991, Randy Weaver was indicted by a federal grand jury. He was arrested and brought before a judge, where a trial date was set. But a critical and still disputed error occurred. A probation officer sent Weaver a letter incorrectly stating that his trial date was a month later than it actually was. When the real court date arrived in February 1991, Randy Weaver did not appear. The judge, unaware of the clerical error, immediately issued a bench warrant for his arrest for failure to appear. In Randy Weaver's mind, the system had proven itself to be a liar and a cheat. He retreated to his mountain fortress with his family, which now included his wife, his 3 daughters, his 14-year-old son, Samuel, and a young family friend named Kevin Harris, who shared their beliefs and had become like an adopted son. They armed themselves and vowed they would not be taken from their land. They would not surrender. They would wait for the final battle that they had always known was coming. With Weaver now officially a federal fugitive, the case was handed over from the ATF to the U.S. Marshal Service, the agency responsible for apprehending fugitives. For the next 18 months, a strange, low-intensity standoff ensued. The Marshals, wary of provoking a violent confrontation, opted for a strategy of surveillance. They set up observation posts on the surrounding mountains, conducted aerial reconnaissance, and tried to develop a psychological profile of Weaver, hoping to find a way to lure him off the mountain peacefully. But Weaver and his family were dug in. They were skilled survivalists, and their home was a highly defensible position. The long, tense waiting game began, a slow, quiet escalation of 2 opposing and utterly unshakable worldviews. On one side was the full, patient power of the United States government. On the other was a single family, armed with guns and a deep, apocalyptic faith, waiting for the end of the world on a lonely mountain ridge in Idaho. For 18 months, the standoff at Ruby Ridge was a silent, simmering war of nerves. The U.S. Marshals, frustrated in their attempts to negotiate a peaceful surrender, decided to escalate their surveillance. Their plan was to find a way to place hidden cameras closer to the Weaver cabin, to gather more intelligence on the family's movements and routines. In August of 1992, they assembled a 6-man reconnaissance team, heavily armed and dressed in full camouflage gear, to move onto the Weaver property under the cover of the dense woods. On the morning of August 21, 1992, the Marshals were making their way up the mountain when their presence was detected, not by a human, but by the family's yellow Labrador retriever, Striker. The dog began to bark furiously, alerting the inhabitants of the cabin. Randy Weaver, his 14-year-old son, Samuel, and the 24-year-old family friend, Kevin Harris, grabbed their rifles and went out to investigate, following the dog down a trail into the woods. What happened next, in a clearing near a fork in the trail known as the Y, is a matter of intense and bitter dispute. According to the Marshals, the dog, Striker, bounded toward them, and they shot it in self-defense. They claimed that Samuel Weaver, just a boy, then fired his own weapon at the Marshals. According to Kevin Harris, the sole surviving witness from the Weaver side, the Marshals shot the dog without provocation. He claimed that Sammy Weaver, seeing his beloved dog killed, yelled, "You shot my dog, you son of a bitch," and fired a single shot in the air in anger, not at the Marshals. Whatever the sequence, the tragic result was the same. A furious gunfight erupted in the woods. U.S. Marshal Art Roderick fired a shot from his M16, hitting Samuel Weaver in the arm. As the boy turned to run back to the cabin, he was struck in the back by a second shot, fired by another Marshal, Larry Cooper. The bullet severed his spinal cord, and 14-year-old Samuel Weaver fell to the ground, dead. At the same moment, Kevin Harris, seeing the boy fall, turned and fired his own high-powered rifle into the trees, hitting U.S. Marshal William Deegan in the chest, killing him instantly. The brief, chaotic firefight was over. It had left 2 people dead, a 42-year-old father of two and decorated U.S. Marshal, and a 14-year-old boy. The long, cold standoff had turned hot and bloody. The surviving marshals retreated down the mountain, carrying the body of their fallen comrade. Kevin Harris, wounded himself, managed to make his way back to the cabin, where he told Randy and Vicky what had happened. They brought Sammy's small body back from the woods and placed it in a shed, beginning a mournful, private vigil. For the Weavers, the prophecy was now complete in its most horrifying form. The forces of Babylon had come to their mountain and had murdered their son. The news of a federal agent being killed in the line of duty transformed the situation instantly. The U.S. Marshals, now in over their heads, called for backup, and the backup that arrived was overwhelming. The FBI's elite hostage rescue team, HRT, the same unit that would later lead the siege at Waco, was dispatched to Ruby Ridge. Within hours, the remote mountain was swarming with hundreds of federal agents, state and local police, and even members of the National Guard. The area was locked down. Snipers took up positions in the surrounding hills. Armored personnel carriers were brought in, their heavy tracks tearing up the quiet mountain roads. A full-scale military siege was now underway. The man in command of the FBI's tactical operation was Richard Rogers, the same commander who would later lead the HRT at Waco. The killing of a federal agent had created an atmosphere of extreme hostility and a desire for retribution. The normal FBI rules of engagement, which strictly limit when and how deadly force can be used, were controversially modified for this specific operation. The new rules of engagement stated that any armed adult male observed in the vicinity of the Weaver cabin could and should be neutralized with deadly force. It was effectively a shoot-on-sight order, a directive that would have catastrophic consequences. On the afternoon of August 22nd, the day after the initial shootout, Randy Weaver, Kevin Harris, and Randy's 16-year-old daughter, Sarah, left the main cabin to go to the small shed where Sammy's body lay. They needed to tend to him to say their goodbyes. As they stepped outside, an FBI sniper named Lon Horiuchi, positioned on a ridge more than 200 yards away, took aim. His first shot hit Randy Weaver in the back, passing through his shoulder. The three of them scrambled back toward the main cabin door in a panic. As they reached the door, Randy turned to hold it open for his daughter and Kevin Harris. Vicky Weaver, holding her 10-month-old baby, Elisheba, stood just inside the doorway, behind the curtain. At that moment, as Randy and Sarah dove for cover, Lon Horiuchi fired a second shot, aiming for Kevin Harris as he ran through the doorway. The .308 caliber bullet missed Harris. It passed through the thin wooden wall of the cabin, through the curtain, and struck Vicky Weaver in the head as she held her baby. She was killed instantly. The same bullet then continued on, striking Kevin Harris in the chest and arm, severely wounding him. Inside the cabin, the scene was one of utter, unimaginable horror. Randy Weaver, wounded himself, watched his wife collapse to the floor, her blood pooling around the infant she had been holding in her arms. His son was dead in a shed, and now his wife was dead on the kitchen floor. The siege had now claimed 3 lives, and the remaining Weavers, Randy and his 3 young daughters, were trapped in their small plywood cabin with their dead mother and a seriously wounded Kevin Harris, surrounded by a federal army. For the next 10 days, a tense and bizarre standoff ensued. The FBI, unaware that Vicky was dead, used a loudspeaker to try to communicate, their messages becoming increasingly strange and taunting. They used a robot to deliver a telephone, but the Weavers refused to answer. The agents addressed Vicky directly, calling her a hateful woman and saying, "Good morning, Mrs. Weaver. We had pancakes for breakfast. What did you have?" Inside, the family huddled in terror, listening to the disembodied voices mock their dead mother. The situation was a powder keg, on the verge of becoming a full-blown massacre. But a new figure arrived on the scene, a man who would change the dynamic of the standoff. It was a retired Green Beret colonel and populist third-party presidential candidate named James Bo Gritz. Gritz was a hero in the patriot and anti-government communities, and he offered to go up the mountain as a civilian negotiator. The FBI, facing a public relations disaster, agreed. Gritz along. with Kevin Harris's own lawyer, made his way up to the cabin. He was someone Randy Weaver trusted, a fellow Green Beret. He was the first person to learn that Vicky was dead. The news, when it was relayed back to the FBI command, sent a shockwave through the operation. The shoot-on-sight order had not just neutralized a threat. It had killed an unarmed woman holding a baby. The siege had become a catastrophe, and a peaceful resolution was now the only acceptable outcome. The revelation that Vicky Weaver had been killed by an FBI sniper fundamentally altered the calculus of the Ruby Ridge standoff. The news, when it was relayed by Bo Gritz from the cabin to the command post below, was a moment of profound shock and crisis for the FBI. The aggressive, tactical posture of the hostage rescue team had resulted in the death of an unarmed woman holding a baby. The operation was now a public relations and ethical disaster of the highest order. The potential for a full-scale assault, which had been a very real possibility, was now completely off the table. The primary objective shifted from apprehending a fugitive to preventing any more bloodshed. Inside the cabin, the situation was grim. For days, Randy Weaver and his 3 surviving daughters, Sarah, Rachel, and the 10-month-old Elisheba, had been huddled in the small, dark space with the decomposing body of their mother. Kevin Harris was gravely wounded, his condition worsening by the hour. They were traumatized, grieving, and terrified, their apocalyptic beliefs seemingly confirmed in the most brutal way imaginable. Bo Gritz became the crucial intermediary, the only person who could bridge the chasm of fear and distrust between the Weaver family and the federal government. He made several trips up to the cabin, carrying messages, building a rapport with the wounded and grieving patriarch. He spoke to Randy Weaver not as a federal agent, but as a fellow soldier. He appealed to his training, his sense of duty to his surviving children, and his faith. Gritz's first priority was to get medical attention for Kevin Harris, who was in desperate need of it. After long, painstaking negotiations, on August 30th, Randy Weaver agreed to let Harris surrender. Harris, weak and in immense pain, was carefully brought out of the cabin and taken into custody, where he was immediately transported to a hospital. With Harris out, the final, most delicate phase of the negotiation began, securing the surrender of Randy Weaver and his daughters. Gritz continued his work, slowly and patiently wearing down Weaver's resistance. He promised Weaver that he would be treated fairly by the legal system and that his children would be cared for. Finally, on August 31st, 11 days after the siege had begun, Randy Weaver walked out of his cabin. He was followed by his 3 daughters, who carried their mother's favorite Bible and their infant sister, Elisheba. The family, which had come to the mountain seeking sanctuary, descended from it shattered and broken. The siege at Ruby Ridge was over. The end of the standoff was the beginning of the legal and political firestorm. Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris were charged with a litany of federal crimes, including the first-degree murder of U.S. Marshal William Degan. The case was set for trial in Boise, Idaho, and it was destined to be a landmark legal battle, a trial that would put not just the defendants on trial, but the actions of the federal government itself. The prosecution, led by the U.S. Attorney's Office, came into the trial with what they believed was a strong case. They had a dead federal agent, 2 fugitives who had resisted arrest, and a mountain of evidence detailing the family's extremist beliefs and their stockpile of weapons. They planned to portray Randy Weaver as a dangerous, racist, anti-government extremist who had conspired with Kevin Harris to lure the marshals into a deadly ambush. But the defense, led by a brilliant and tenacious defense attorney from Wyoming named Jerry Spence, had a powerful counter-narrative. Spence was a master courtroom storyteller, a lawyer known for his folksy charm, his buckskin jacket, and his fierce advocacy for the underdog. He did not deny that his clients had possessed illegal weapons or that they had resisted arrest. Instead, he reframed the entire story. He argued that the Weavers were not the aggressors. They were the victims. Spence painted a vivid picture of a family who, whatever their strange beliefs, simply wanted to be left alone. He detailed the government's initial entrapment of Weaver in the sawed-off shotgun case, arguing that the entire chain of events was set in motion by a flawed and overzealous ATF investigation. He then focused on the events of the siege itself, particularly the killing of Sammy Weaver and Vicki Weaver. The emotional heart of the trial was the testimony of Randy Weaver's 16-year-old daughter, Sarah. In a quiet, halting voice, she described the shootout at the Y, the moment she saw her younger brother killed, and the horrifying instant when her mother was shot in the head while holding her baby sister. Her testimony was devastatingly powerful, transforming the defendants from dangerous extremists into a grieving father and a young man who had acted to defend a family under attack. Jerry Spence's cross-examination of the federal agents was relentless. He exposed the inconsistencies in the marshal's accounts of the initial shootout. Most damningly, he dismantled the credibility of the FBI and its controversial rules of engagement. He forced FBI Commander Richard Rogers to admit on the stand that the shoot-on-sight order was highly unusual and that it had led directly to Vicki Weaver's death. He showed the jury the horrific photos of Vicki's body and read the transcripts of the FBI negotiators taunting her after she was already dead. Spence argued that the government's case was a desperate attempt to cover up its own incompetence and criminal negligence. He told the jury that the real crime had not been committed by Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris, but by a federal government that had terrorized, entrapped, and ultimately murdered members of an American family. This case is about a man and a family who made the tragic mistake of believing that the Constitution of this country applies to everyone, Spence declared in his closing argument. He asked the jury not to compound the tragedy by sending an innocent man and a grieving father to prison. The trial lasted for 2 months. In July of 1993, the jury, after deliberating for nearly 3 weeks, returned its verdict. It was a stunning and almost total rebuke of the government's case. They acquitted Kevin Harris of all charges, including the murder of Marshall Degan. They found that he had, in fact, acted in self-defense after seeing Sammy Weaver killed. They acquitted Randy Weaver of the most serious charges, including murder, conspiracy, and aiding and abetting. They found him guilty only on 2 minor counts: failure to appear for his original court date and violating the conditions of his bail. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in prison, and with credit for time already served, he was released just a few months later. The verdict was a shocking victory for the defense and a humiliating defeat for the Department of Justice. A jury of ordinary Idaho citizens had listened to the evidence and had concluded that the government, not the Weavers, was the primary aggressor. The trial was over, but the story of Ruby Ridge and the questions it raised about the use of deadly force and the accountability of federal law enforcement were far from settled. The acquittals of Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris were not just a legal verdict. They were a profound cultural and political moment. The outcome of the trial validated the deep-seated fears of a growing segment of the American population that was deeply suspicious of federal authority. For the burgeoning patriot and militia movements of the 1990s, Ruby Ridge was not a tragedy. It was a prophecy fulfilled, a cornerstone of their mythology. It was, in their eyes, irrefutable proof that the federal government, which they often referred to as ZOG, was a tyrannical, illegitimate force willing to murder its own citizens, including women and children, for daring to defy its will. Randy Weaver, the quiet separatist who had just wanted to be left alone, was transformed into an reluctant icon, a hero of the anti-government cause. The story of his family's stand on the mountain became a powerful rallying cry, a modern-day Alamo for those who believed they were fighting a second American Revolution. The words Ruby Ridge and Vicki Weaver became a kind of shorthand, a code for government overreach and deadly incompetence, chanted at protests and printed on bumper stickers across the country. The legacy of Ruby Ridge became inextricably and tragically linked with 2 other major events of the 1990s. The first was the siege at Waco, Texas, which occurred just 6 months after the standoff in Idaho. The FBI's disastrous handling of the Branch Davidian situation, culminating in the fiery deaths of nearly 80 people, was seen by many as a direct extension of the same institutional arrogance and tactical aggression that had led to the deaths of Sammy and Vicki Weaver. The 2 events, Waco and Ruby Ridge, became twin pillars in the narrative of a federal government run amok. This narrative, in turn, provided the direct ideological fuel for the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history. On April 19, 1995, the second anniversary of the Waco fire, Timothy McVeigh detonated a truck bomb outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. McVeigh was a product of the same anti-government culture that had canonized Randy Weaver. He saw his act of mass murder as a righteous act of war, a direct retaliation against the federal agencies, specifically the ATF and the FBI, that he held responsible for the murders at Ruby Ridge and Waco. The blood that was shed in the Idaho woods had, in a very real sense, fertilized the ground for the far greater tragedy that would unfold in the heartland 2 years later. In the wake of the trial and the growing public outcry, the federal government was forced into a period of painful introspection. The Department of Justice launched its own internal investigation into the actions of the FBI and the U.S. Marshals at Ruby Ridge. The resulting report, released in 1994, was a blistering critique of the agency's conduct. It condemned the shoot-on-sight rules of engagement as unconstitutional and found that the FBI sniper, Lon Horiuchi, had violated the Bureau's own deadly force policy when he fired the second, fatal shot that killed Vicki Weaver. However, the report stopped short of recommending criminal charges against any of the agents involved, concluding that the chaotic and hostile environment of the siege made their actions, while wrong, not criminally prosecutable. This lack of criminal accountability was unacceptable to many. The U.S. Senate held its own series of hearings, which further exposed the flawed decision-making and the subsequent attempts to cover up the failures of the operation. In 1995, the Weaver family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the federal government. In a rare move, the government chose to settle the case out of court, paying the 3 surviving Weaver daughters a total of $3.1 million. The settlement was not an admission of guilt, but it was a clear, tacit acknowledgement of the government's culpability in the deaths of Vicki and Samuel Weaver. Kevin Harris also received a settlement of his own. The long-term impact of Ruby Ridge on federal law enforcement was significant. The disaster, along with the subsequent catastrophe at Waco, forced a major reevaluation of siege tactics and the use of deadly force. The incident became a case study at the FBI Academy, a powerful negative example of how not to handle a standoff. It led to the development of more sophisticated negotiation teams, a greater emphasis on de-escalation, and stricter, clearer rules of engagement designed to prevent the kind of mission creep and tactical aggression that had led to the tragedy. Today, the story of Ruby Ridge remains a deeply divisive and sorrowful chapter in American history. For some, it is the story of a dangerous extremist who brought a tragedy upon his own family through his paranoia and defiance of the law. For others, it is the story of a family persecuted for their beliefs, victims of an overzealous and trigger-happy government. The truth, as it often is, likely lies in the complicated, tragic space in between. It was a perfect storm of one family's extreme, apocalyptic paranoia and a government's institutional arrogance, a collision of 2 worlds that could not, and would not, understand each other. The cabin on the mountain is gone now, burned to the ground years after the standoff. But the name Ruby Ridge endures. It is a place, but it is also an idea. It stands as a chilling, cautionary tale about the dangers of seeing the world in black and white, of the tragic, violent consequences that can occur when communication fails, when fear hardens into dogma, and when the government, in its effort to enforce the law, loses sight of the fundamental humanity of the people it is sworn to protect. It is a story of how a small dispute over 2 sawed-off shotguns could spiral into a national tragedy, leaving 3 people dead on a lonely mountain and a legacy of anger and distrust that continues to echo through the American political landscape to this day.